Hey there, night owls. Tonight we're slipping into a part of history that no one really talks about out loud, but everyone's curious about. Think smoke curling through crooked alleys, the soft creak of worn wooden steps, and velvet curtains that definitely didn't block out the sounds behind them. We're stepping straight into the murky, candlelit world of medieval brothels. Not the romanticized nonsense with rose petals and lute music, but the real places, where hygiene was optional, laws were flexible, and power played out in the quiet corners of the night. Now, fair warning, what you're about to hear isn't pretty. This journey includes a healthy dose of scandal, desperation, and body odor that could haunt a monastery. If you've ever wondered what life was like in the places medieval cities tried to pretend didn't exist while quietly collecting taxes from them, you're in the right place. Let's go behind the doors that history tried to close and see what was really going on inside. Under the crooked roofs of medieval towns, past the muddy streets and shadowed alleyways, there stood buildings that no one talked about, but everyone recognized. Their shutters were often painted a deep crimson or sealed tightly with thick wooden boards, not to keep light out, but to keep curiosity at bay. These were not places advertised with signs or bells. They didn't need them. A single flickering lantern by the door, a half-open window at dusk, or the rhythmic sound of footsteps echoing late into the night. These were enough to signal what lay within. These were the brothels of medieval Europe, and behind their closed doors was a world as real and ordinary as the marketplace, yet draped in secrecy, shame, and fascination. Unlike the towering cathedrals or bustling taverns that defined the public spaces of the city, brothels occupied a strange position, visible but unspeakable. You could walk by one every day, and even if you never stepped inside, you knew what it was. They were often located just beyond the central square, not too hidden, not too exposed, close enough to serve those in power, but far enough from the church steps to avoid scandal. Their architecture gave them away: low windows, heavy curtains, courtyards surrounded by walls too high for any honest business, and the subtle perfume of overused incense trying to mask something less pleasant. But if you think these places were quiet dens of forbidden activity, you'd be mistaken. Some were raucous and loud, especially during festivals or after battles. Others were surprisingly orderly, even professional, depending on who ran them and which city you were in. In places like Paris or Venice, brothels were woven into the urban fabric with a mix of tolerance and control. The authorities didn't just allow them, they often regulated them. Laws dictated how many women could live in a single house, what clothing they could wear, even which days they were permitted to work. The idea wasn't to eliminate these places, it was to manage them, because the truth was, they served a purpose. Visitors came from all walks of life. There were traveling merchants looking for comfort after long days on the road, young apprentices who saved a few coins from their master's wage, soldiers with nowhere to go between campaigns, and yes, even men of power, aldermen, priests, and city guards, whose presence blurred the line between morality and necessity. Some arrived cloaked and silent, entering quickly with their heads low. Others came openly drunk with pride or wine, laughing loud enough for the whole street to hear. Yet for all the comings and goings, the brothel remained a mystery to those outside. What happened behind those walls was the subject of whispers, rumors, and tavern stories. People imagined wild scenes or scandalous encounters, but few knew the routines, the quiet despair, or the harsh rules that shaped life inside. The mystery only made the allure stronger. It was a place that didn't fit into the clean boxes of sin or virtue. It existed somewhere in between, a space the city both needed and condemned. Even the language people used to describe these houses was coded. In London, they were called stews, borrowing a term once used for bathhouses. In Florence, they might be referred to as case chiuse, literally closed houses. Everywhere, the names avoided direct mention of what occurred inside. The silence wasn't just polite, it was structural. Entire neighborhoods were shaped around this silence. You could live on the same street as a brothel and never acknowledge it in conversation. Yet your rent might be cheaper because of it. The local baker might deliver bread to its door. The laundress might carry out soiled linens once a week. The city went on, pretending not to see what was always in plain sight. To understand medieval brothels is to step into this contradiction. They were spaces of commerce, spaces of survival, and spaces of illusion. They provided something people wanted, but at a cost they rarely questioned. They were not glamorous, they were not always dangerous, but they were always loaded with expectation, judgment, and a strange kind of permission. Permission to escape, to pretend, to possess, to forget. For the women inside, and for the men who visited, these houses offered temporary shelter from the rigid rules of outside life. In a society governed by order, obligation, and hierarchy, the brothel was a world where those rules bent. It was where names could be forgotten, time could blur, and what was forbidden elsewhere became routine. Yet the illusion had limits. The walls were thin, the money never lasted, and outside those doors, everything returned to normal, or at least pretended to. That's what made them both fascinating and unsettling. Not the acts themselves, but the way society danced around them. It wasn't just the people inside who played roles. The entire city was part of the performance. Officials pretended not to notice. Priests preached repentance while looking the other way. And ordinary people walked past in silence, eyes forward, hearts pounding just a little faster than usual. So next time you picture the Middle Ages, stone towers, armored knights, and candlelit chapels, pause and shift your gaze a few streets over. There, hidden in the half-light, are the buildings no one speaks of but everyone remembers. The brothels were not anomalies. They were part of the architecture, part of the economy, part of life. And what happened behind their closed shutters tells us more about the people of the time than any royal decree or holy sermon ever could. Shall we go inside? They say a city reveals its true character not by what it builds, but by what it permits. And in the medieval world, few things were more revealing than the way brothels were not only tolerated, but shaped, licensed, and taxed by the very institutions that claimed moral authority. What began as hidden corners of indulgence slowly transformed into semi-legitimate enterprises woven into the legal and financial systems of towns and kingdoms. These weren't lawless dens operating in the shadows, at least not always. More often than not, they were supervised, documented, and even protected by those with power, because in the end, control was more desirable than chaos. In many cities, municipal leaders discovered that it was easier and more profitable to regulate desire than to suppress it. A completely forbidden trade would scatter across the city like spilled ink, impossible to track or contain. But if you gathered it in one place, defined its boundaries, and put it under watchful eyes, you could not only reduce public disorder, but also generate steady income. That's exactly what began to happen in places like Toulouse, London, Florence, and Cologne. City councils passed statutes that designated specific districts where such houses could operate, setting rules for their visibility, staff, hours of operation, and, most notably, taxes. The logic was simple. If it's going to exist anyway, make it manageable, make it profitable, and keep it from spilling into places where it might cause scandal. The church, contrary to modern assumptions, was not always a fierce opponent of these establishments. While sermons thundered from the pulpits about virtue and repentance, clerics and bishops often played a quieter, more pragmatic game. Some religious orders saw licensed brothels as a way to protect honest women from being harassed in the streets. Others viewed them as a lesser evil, a controlled outlet that, in theory, preserved the sanctity of marriage by keeping temptation confined to designated quarters. Even in Rome itself, the capital of Christian orthodoxy, tolerance toward certain houses of pleasure was part of a long and awkward dance between doctrine and reality. This uneasy compromise was reflected in the official language. Civic documents would refer to brothels with curious euphemisms, houses of women, public hospitality, or even places of rest. The people who ran them were not usually criminals in the eyes of the law, but property owners and entrepreneurs, some of whom came from the lower nobility or wealthy merchant families. For the city officials, what mattered was not the morality of the enterprise, but its reliability. Were the women registered? Was the rent paid on time? Were the taxes delivered without dispute? If yes, then the moral outrage could wait. In return for this legitimacy, the brothels had to play by the rules. In some cities, women working in such establishments were required to wear specific clothing, usually yellow, a color associated with disgrace, so they would be instantly recognizable in public. They could not leave their quarters at night. They were forbidden from wearing jewelry, and in some regions, they had to stay inside the designated quarter of the city unless accompanied. These restrictions weren't only about control, they were about visibility. By marking the women so clearly, society could separate them from respectable citizens, creating an illusion of moral order while quietly profiting from the very behavior it condemned. The profits, of course, did not stay within the walls of the brothel. They flowed upward. Landlords collected rent, tavern owners provided food and drink, local guards received unofficial payments for keeping the peace, and magistrates took their share through fines, permits, and annual fees. In some cities, a portion of the brothel revenue was even allocated to public works, roads, bridges, marketplaces, funded, ironically, by the very same women who were kept on the margins of that public life. Yet behind this careful structure, a deeper hypocrisy pulsed. Those in power framed regulation as a form of civic hygiene, a way to isolate and manage a necessary vice. But in reality, it was about preserving appearances while maintaining access. By formalizing brothels, cities allowed the elite to indulge in discretion. The same men who wrote the laws often became the most frequent visitors, and the walls that supposedly confined shame often served as shelter for the privileged. In some rare cases, the protection of the city extended so far that brothel owners were granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for supplying information to authorities. The house became not just a place of transaction, but a node in the city's web of power and surveillance. What emerges is a portrait not of a deviant fringe, but of an institution that served multiple roles. It was a business, a pressure valve, a social hierarchy, and above all, a mirror. In regulating the brothel, the city was regulating itself, balancing appetite against reputation, profit against piety. And just like the brothel itself, the city wore two faces, one for daylight and one for after dark. Not all doors are opened by desire. Some are pushed open by hunger, others by fear, and many by the simple absence of any other way forward. In the medieval world, where class and gender dictated the limits of a life before it had even begun, the path into a brothel was rarely chosen freely. The myth of the seductive temptress, the woman who simply craved pleasure and pursued a life of vice by choice, fades quickly when placed beside the quiet realities that drove so many into the arms of this profession. Behind every woman who entered a brothel stood a story of limited options, unpayable debts, fractured families, and a society that punished poverty far more severely than it punished cruelty. Some of the women arrived at a young age, barely old enough to carry firewood, let alone comprehend the consequences of the decision being made on their behalf. Orphaned by plague or war, they were passed from hand to hand, often ending up in city shelters or among distant relatives who could barely feed themselves. It was not uncommon for guardians or impoverished parents to strike quiet deals, food, coin, or shelter, in exchange for sending a girl to work in a house whose real purpose was never spoken aloud. There were no signed contracts. There was only survival, and survival has its own rules. Others found themselves trapped by promises that were never meant to be kept. Traveling alone to a city in search of work, they might be offered lodging and a job in a tavern, a laundry, or as a maid. By the time they realized what kind of house they had entered, the door had already shut behind them. With no friends, no family, and no means of escape, they were told the rules, handed the uniform, and added to the roster. Some fought, some cried, some ran, but the street was not safer than the house, and more often than not, they returned. Then there were those whose descent into the brothel began with love, or what looked like it. Promises whispered by men with warm eyes and steady hands, offer of marriage, escape from drudgery, a new life in a different town, only to be sold, traded, or abandoned when the illusion wore off. The term love trap was not a poetic metaphor. It was a practiced tactic. Some women were victims of organized recruitment schemes that preyed on desperation. Cities like Avignon, Naples, and London had entire networks that funneled vulnerable women into brothels under the guise of opportunity. Once inside, protest meant little. The system wasn't built to listen. There were also women who had worked as servants or washerwomen, earning just enough to scrape by. A single missed payment, a broken contract, or a false accusation could land them in debt. And debt was a powerful force, one that could strip away legal protections, bind them to a house, and convert them into laborers whose only means of repayment was their own body. In many brothels, women were not paid directly. Instead, they were charged for their meals, clothes, bedding, and even the air they breathed within the walls. The more they worked, the deeper the debt. The illusion of freedom quickly vanished beneath the weight of invisible chains. And yet, even among these shadows, it would be dishonest to claim there was no spectrum of experience. A few women did walk through those doors with their eyes open, seeking autonomy in a world where other forms of independence were denied. They chose a brothel over a bad marriage, over starvation, or over the grind of domestic service. For them, the house offered a kind of brutal freedom, dangerous, stigmatized, but free from the control of fathers or husbands. These stories were rare, but they existed, and they remind us that agency, even when limited, could sometimes be asserted in the smallest and most unlikely ways. Still, these exceptions could not erase the dominant pattern. The majority did not choose. They were chosen, not for their aspirations, but for their lack of alternatives. Society labeled them impure, immoral, unworthy of sympathy, but it was society itself that created the conditions which led them there. A woman without a dowry, a woman without a man, a woman who spoke too loudly, laughed too freely, or simply had the misfortune of being poor. She was a candidate. She was vulnerable, and once inside, the label stuck. It followed her wherever she went. A woman could leave the brothel, but the brothel never left her. Future work was hard to find, marriage nearly impossible, respect out of reach. The past clung to her like smoke on clothes, noticed even when unsaid. Some tried to reinvent themselves under new names in distant towns. Others entered convents, not for faith, but for shelter. But many stayed, because staying, at least, meant knowing the rules of the game. The story of how women ended up in brothels is not a story about desire. It is a story about structures, economic, familial, legal, that offered few exits and many traps. It is about how societies can manufacture shame while benefiting from the systems that produce it. And most of all, it is about how silence can be louder than any confession. Because while the records speak little of these women's voices, their presence was etched into every city wall, every alley shadow, and every night when the lights stayed on, long after the bells had stopped ringing. Morning didn't begin with sunlight in a medieval brothel. It began with footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing off timber floors as the keeper or matron made her first rounds. The women, many of whom had barely rested, stirred from straw mattresses or shared beds, their limbs sore from the night before. There was no luxury of a private space. Sleep came in crowded quarters, often behind thin curtains or in rooms where whispers had no place to hide. Privacy was not a right, but a rare accident. The first task was to clean. Sheets were shaken out, floors swept, basins filled with cold water drawn from nearby wells or cisterns. Hygiene was expected, not out of concern for health, but for profit. A clean room could command a higher fee, so the women scrubbed themselves with cloths soaked in vinegar or rose water, combed their hair with wooden picks, and dusted powder onto their skin to mask fatigue. The smell of stale wine and smoke clung to the walls, but effort was made to cover it with herbs, oils, and perfume that was rarely subtle. Everything had to appear fresh, even if nothing truly was. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was simple. a slice of bread, perhaps some soft cheese or weak ale. Meat was a rarity unless one of the more generous clients had left behind a portion. Most of what the women consumed came from the brothel's shared kitchen, where one or two cooks prepared meals not for pleasure, but for efficiency. Hunger was a constant companion. The food, often deducted from their earnings, came at a price. A warm bowl of stew might cost more than a night's peace. As the day unfolded, so did the labor. The brothel was not just a space for evening traffic, it functioned around the clock. In the earlier hours, some women did laundry or repaired garments, their fingers cracked and raw from cold water and coarse fabric. Others helped restock the pantry, took inventory, or polished boots left behind by clients. The work never stopped. Even when not with visitors, the women were expected to serve, maintain, present. Midday was quieter, a brief lull when the streets bustled with merchants and townsfolk, and few customers came calling. This was the only moment that allowed for conversation between the women, but even then the mood was heavy. They spoke in whispers, shared scraps of news, told half-truths about their pasts, or made bitter jokes about the men who came and went. Laughter, when it came, was sharp-edged and short-lived. Trust was fragile in a place where everyone had something to lose, and no one could afford sentiment. When afternoon slipped into evening, the rhythm of the house changed. Candles were lit, curtains drawn, bodies prepared. Clothes were chosen with care, nothing too extravagant to attract suspicion, but just enough to invite interest. Some women painted their cheeks with crushed berries or outlined their eyes with ash and charcoal. The transformation was practiced, almost ritualistic. It was less about allure and more about survival. Looking tired could mean being passed over. Being passed over meant earning nothing. Earning nothing meant hunger, debt, and punishment. By nightfall, the house filled with voices, some eager, others demanding. Men arrived in groups or alone, cloaked against recognition, carrying the weight of their reputations into a space designed to dissolve them. The women greeted them with forced ease, memorizing names and preferences, offering warmth they didn't feel. Each encounter was a performance, an act of endurance. Behind every smile was calculation, how to keep the customer satisfied without giving too much of themselves away, how to finish quickly, how to avoid danger. And danger was never far. Not all clients were gentle. Some came angry, others intoxicated. The women learned to read their moods the way sailors read the sky, watching for signs, adjusting course, bracing for storms. There were no guards standing nearby, no rescue when things went wrong. The only protection came from reputation, alliances, or in the worst cases, submission. A single act of defiance could cost a woman everything. When the last candle flickered and the last visitor left, the house exhaled. But sleep did not come easily. Wounds had to be tended, ledgers updated, rooms cleaned once more. The matron, or sometimes the owner himself, counted earnings, deducted expenses, issued warnings. Sometimes arguments erupted over money, over treatment, over who had worked hardest and earned the least. Exhaustion was a constant backdrop. Still, the women endured, not because they were strong by nature, but because there was no other choice. And then, in the smallest hours before dawn, the brothel would fall quiet. Those who had cried did so into their blankets. Those who had nothing left to say stared at the ceiling, their minds floating somewhere between dreams and numbness. In that silence, the real weight of the day settled, not just the weight of bodies or bruises, but the emotional cost of being constantly available, constantly judged, constantly performing. This wasn't simply work, it was a form of erasure, of boundaries, of identity, of personal time. It took everything and gave back only what was necessary to keep going. Yet amid the exhaustion, moments of humanity survived. A shared song hummed softly while washing linens. A stolen apple split between two hands. A whispered prayer before sleep, not for rescue, but for endurance. These moments didn't fix anything, but they made the next sunrise bearable. And when it came, that sunrise didn't mark a new beginning. It only meant the cycle would begin again. The same floors, the same faces, the same hollow exchanges. So from the outside, it was easy to imagine that what happened in the brothel was simple, transactional, even indulgent. But from within, it was something else entirely. A relentless rhythm of labor, masked by candlelight, measured not in pleasure but in survival. Behind every medieval brothel stood someone who never had to live inside it. Someone who didn't wash the sheets, endure the nights, or offer false smiles to men who never asked for names. Someone who watched from above, sometimes literally, from a separate room, a separate life, always counting. The illusion of choice within those walls was carefully maintained, but ownership was never ambiguous. The women were not independent workers. They were property, managed, assigned, and, whether through contract, debt, or coercion, effectively owned by the very people who profited from their exhaustion. These owners came in many forms. In some towns, they were male landlords or entrepreneurs who held licenses to operate such establishments, protected by city charters and guards on their payroll. In others, they were retired soldiers, tavern keepers, or even minor nobles looking to supplement their income through ventures deemed morally distant but financially promising. Their involvement was rarely direct. They did not need to speak to the women or understand their needs. They had stewards for that, and those stewards had assistants of their own. Like any business, the brothel functioned through layers of command, each one further removed from the suffering at the bottom. But not all owners were men. In several cities, especially where the brothel was municipally sanctioned, women ran the operations. These matrons or madams, often former workers themselves, had risen not through freedom, but through hierarchy. They were given control in exchange for obedience to the rules. They maintained order, oversaw payments, assigned clients, and kept records. In return, they received a percentage of the profits and a position of relative stability. Their authority, however, was limited. They were managers, not masters. If they failed to keep the house profitable, orderly, or compliant, they too could be replaced, punished, or returned to service. Some of these women developed reputations, feared, respected, sometimes even admired. They could enforce strict discipline, demand silence, and dictate who worked which room on which night. To the outside world, they were seen as powerful figures. But behind closed doors, their power was only as strong as the favor of the real owners or the goodwill of the local authorities. They navigated a fragile space, balancing cruelty and compassion, often wielding both in equal measure to keep their house in order. Security in the brothel was another layer of control. Larger establishments employed guards or doormen, men whose job was to keep out the unwanted and keep in the unwilling. These guards were not there for the women's protection. They were there for the house's reputation. If a client became violent, the guards might intervene, but only if the noise threatened to disturb neighbors or drive away business. If a woman tried to escape or refused a client, they ensured obedience. Loyalty was not to the people inside, but to the profits collected at the end of the week. And then there were the middlemen, those who did not own the buildings, but controlled the flow of people into them. These were the true architects of exploitation. They recruited, transported, and placed women in brothels across towns and regions, often using lies, coercion, or outright purchase. Some posed as matchmakers, others as employers. Their networks reached from rural villages to city streets, and their success depended on how many lives they could funnel into the system. For every woman who arrived at a brothel, someone had profited before she even crossed the threshold. In some regions, these intermediaries worked openly. In others, they operated in secret, bribing officials or forging documents. The line between criminal and legal blurred often. Cities that wanted to appear virtuous outlawed such figures in name, while quietly tolerating their presence for the sake of maintaining the supply. The system didn't need to be fair, it only needed to be efficient. Money, as always, flowed upward. The women earned coins from clients, but those coins passed through many hands before reaching their own. Fees were deducted for meals, for rooms, for clothing, for protection. In many brothels, women owed so much that they were constantly in debt, regardless of how many hours they worked. This debt was no accident. It was engineered to bind them. A woman in debt could not leave. A woman in debt had no bargaining power. She could be moved, replaced, or punished, and no one would intervene. Even cities that claimed to regulate brothels for safety allowed this structure to thrive. They didn't see the women as citizens, but as part of an industry. If a woman disappeared, there were no questions. If she fell ill or could no longer work, she was replaced. Invoices continued. Rent was still due. The brothel, then, was not just a place. It was a machine. At its center were the women, exhausted, watched, and counted. Around them spun layers of management, security, politics, and trade. At the top sat the silent few who never needed to enter the house to own it completely. The control was total, even when it appeared informal. It was built into every rule, every fee, every locked door. And while the front of the building might whisper of intimacy or pleasure, behind it pulsed a system as cold and calculated as any factory. This was the true architecture of power in the medieval brothel, not candles and silk, but ledgers and silence, not choice, but containment. And the further one stepped from the flickering lights of the inner room, the clearer the design became. When the sun dipped below the crooked rooftops and the bells marked the end of daily trade, a different city began to stir. The stalls were shuttered, the churches locked, the squares emptying under the soft pull of night. But not every door closed at dusk. Some creaked open, quietly, cautiously, and from those doors emerged figures cloaked not just in fabric, but in secrecy. This was the hour when the brothel transformed, not from hidden to exposed, but from tolerated to frequented. because while society pretended to recoil from what lay within, it was often the most respected men of the city who slipped through those candlelit thresholds when no one was watching. The clientele was never limited to vagrants or drunkards. In fact, the higher the status, the more carefully the visit was arranged. City officials, magistrates, tax collectors, even mayors were known guests. They arrived in silence, sometimes escorted by aides who waited outside, turning their backs to the door as if that could protect them from implication. These men passed laws by day and bent them by night, issuing fines for public indecency while privately reserving a room in the house they publicly condemned. Their names were never spoken aloud by the women, but everyone in the house knew them, knew their preferences, their tempers, their silences. The church, despite its harsh sermons and threats of punishment, was no less involved. Monks from nearby abbeys, priests from local parishes, even senior clerics found their way to these houses. They spoke in whispers and paid well for discretion. Some justified their presence as a test of their resolve. Others came with no such pretenses. And the brothel, accustomed to contradiction, made no distinction. Coin was coin, whether carried in a noble's purse or a bishop's sleeve. Knights, too, were common visitors, especially those returning from campaign or en route to new assignments. They arrived boasting stories, their boots caked with mud, swords left outside the door. They paid in foreign currency or in goods looted from distant fields. Some came alone, seeking brief company before another journey. Others arrived in groups, turning the house into a night-long theater of laughter, shouting, and indulgence. Their presence was often welcomed by the brothel's owners. Nobles had deep pockets and wide influence, but for the women, it was a night of endurance. Men raised in battle did not always leave their armor at the door, and yet, despite the late-night comings and goings, society never spoke these names aloud. It was an unspoken agreement. What happened in the brothel stayed there, buried beneath layers of decorum and denial. The hypocrisy was not subtle, it was strategic. These visits were not random or rare, they were frequent and expected. The brothel functioned as a private annex of the public square, a release valve for tension, a blind spot in the city's moral architecture. Sometimes, these relationships went even deeper. A well-connected official might sponsor a woman in the house, covering her debts in exchange for loyalty. A merchant might use the brothel as a meeting place, striking business deals in the privacy of its chambers. In certain cases, entire political plots were whispered through the veil of a curtain while the city outside remained unaware. The brothel was not just a space of indulgence, it was a social hub, a place where power moved in silence. The women, of course, learned quickly to read these men. They knew when to speak and when to nod. They memorized titles, affiliations, rumors. Some kept journals, not for blackmail, but for memory. Protection came from knowing too much. A well-placed threat, a dropped name, a single look in the wrong tavern could shift the balance. The most skilled women didn't just offer companionship. They gathered information. They built quiet leverage. In a world that took everything from them, knowledge became a form of resistance. And the brothel itself, while officially excluded from civic life, often served civic purposes. During festivals, visiting dignitaries were sometimes escorted there discreetly as part of the city's hospitality. In times of political unrest, spies used brothels to gather intelligence. Even law enforcement turned to brothel keepers for information, asking what stranger passed through, what accent was overheard, what name was murmured in sleep. These houses weren't hidden from the city, they were embedded in it, as essential and as invisible as the plumbing beneath its cobbled streets. This duality, the condemnation and the participation, formed one of the most striking contradictions of the medieval world. The same hands that signed decrees against moral corruption were the ones that knocked quietly after sundown. The same mouths that praised chastity in sermons whispered requests behind closed doors. And everyone, from the highest tower to the lowest alley, knew it. But no one said a word. Because the brothel didn't exist to serve the weak, it existed to accommodate the powerful. And as long as the powerful needed it, it would be protected, not through open defense, but through practiced silence. That silence, more than any wall or lock, was the brothel's strongest shield, and within it the house stood, lit by candles, surrounded by shadow, filled each night not just with desire, but with the very men who pretended to be above it. From the outside, it may have seemed like the women inside the brothel were earning a living, perhaps even a decent one. Coins exchanged hands nightly, the rooms were rarely empty, and men left behind purses lighter than when they entered. But beneath this illusion of profit lay a system carefully engineered to keep the workers exactly where they were, trapped, dependent, and always just a little too poor to leave. For those inside, money was not freedom, it was a leash. And the tighter it was pulled, the more impossible it became to imagine escape. The earnings of a single night varied wildly. A well-dressed client might leave behind a silver coin, a generous one, perhaps a small pouch with extra. On paper, it looked promising, but the house took its share first, always, for the room, for the candles, for the wine poured to loosen a guest's tongue, for the bathwater drawn, even for the linen that would be washed come morning. Every service came at a cost, and every cost was deducted. A woman who served 3 clients in one night might wake to find that she owed the house more than she had earned. Then came the expenses of daily life, which were rarely paid directly, but charged back like interest. Food, often poor in quality, was tallied per portion. Clothes, chosen not for comfort, but for presentation, were often rented or sold at inflated prices. Even illness, when it struck, came with a bill. Ointments, herbs, and the visit of a midwife or healer all added to the mounting debt. And since most brothels handled their own books, there was no way to dispute what was written. The numbers were final, no matter how false. Some women tried to save what they could, tucking away coins beneath floorboards or inside the seams of their garments. But savings brought suspicion. If a keeper noticed someone growing too ambitious, she might suddenly find herself assigned only the least profitable clients or burdened with extra fines. Debt wasn't just a consequence, it was policy. It kept the women tied to the house, unable to leave without paying off a total they could never fully track. And the rules were simple. If you can't pay, you can't go. Leaving without settling debts was considered theft. And in cities where brothels were regulated by law, fleeing a house was treated as a civic offense. Local guards could be dispatched to bring back a runaway, especially if the owner had powerful friends. In some towns, women who tried to escape could be branded or imprisoned, their flight viewed not as desperation, but as defiance. The law sided with the house, not the person. But the deepest trap wasn't physical, it was psychological. After weeks turned into months, and months into years, the women began to internalize the idea that leaving was not just impossible, but absurd. Where would they go? Who would hire them? They had no references, no standing, and no protection. Their names had been stained by rumor and record. Even the smallest towns whispered loudly. A woman who left a brothel was seen as marked, her past always shadowing her steps. Occasionally, a client might offer a way out, promising to pay her debt, to start a new life together, to take her far from the city. These stories almost always ended in betrayal. The man disappeared, or the debt proved larger than expected, or the brothel refused to release her, finding a new fee, a new reason, a new lie. And in rare cases, when someone did manage to leave, she often found herself pulled back, not by force, but by need. With no money, no shelter, and no legal identity, returning to the house became the only option. Not because it was safe, but because it was familiar. The system was a loop, meticulously crafted. Profit depended not just on what the women could provide, but on keeping them in a state of constant lack. Independence was discouraged. Planning for the future was mocked. Those who dreamed too loudly were reminded, through rules, debts, and punishment, that they belonged to the house, and the house belonged to someone else. At the top of this chain, the owners and intermediaries lived comfortably. They collected rent, took their share of each transaction, and passed the risk down the ladder. The structure was elegant in its cruelty. The harder the women worked, the deeper they sank. The system gave just enough to prevent collapse, but never enough to permit escape. It offered illusion after illusion, money that wasn't theirs, choices that weren't real, freedom always just out of reach. This wasn't accidental. It was economic design, rooted in the same logic as the feudal system outside the brothel walls. Keep the laborers dependent, keep them grateful for scraps, make the cost of leaving greater than the cost of staying. And so, night after night, the rooms filled, the coins clinked, and the ledgers grew heavier. The women laughed when they had to, cried when no one saw, and survived between the numbers. Some came to see their lives not as temporary, but permanent. Others never stopped hoping, but quietly, secretly, afraid that hope itself might be taken as rebellion. In the end, the brothel didn't just take the body, it took the future. It converted dreams into debts, and debts into chains. And while the city slept, believing its pleasure came without cost, the real price was being paid every day, behind closed doors, in the quiet subtraction of someone's freedom. Beneath the surface of painted cheeks and flickering candlelight, far from the fantasies whispered by visiting men or conjured by the outside world, lived a truth too grim for most to face. The brothel, for all its illusions of warmth and intimacy, was one of the most dangerous places a woman could inhabit in the medieval world. Not because of swords or street crime, but because of what happened in silence, because of what no one wanted to see, because of what was quietly accepted as the cost of keeping the system running. Violence was not an exception. It was routine. It came in many forms, some sudden, some slow, but all destructive. Clients, emboldened by coin and anonymity, could treat women however they pleased. There were no contracts, no promises, no accountability. A refusal could result in a beating. A delay in service might lead to a slap, or worse. Alcohol blurred boundaries, and entitlement erased them entirely. Some men arrived already angry, others grew dangerous as the night wore on. And while the brothel might post rules about conduct, no one truly enforced them. A woman left, bruised or bleeding, was often blamed for provoking the man, for not smiling enough, for not knowing her place. The injuries ranged from broken bones to internal damage, sometimes subtle enough to ignore, other times catastrophic. Without proper medical care, something only the wealthy could afford, wounds festered, bones healed crooked, scars became permanent. A woman who was injured too often or looked too worn could be cast aside, replaced, or demoted to the least favorable duties. The brothel had no retirement plan. There was no safety net for those it chewed through. But the more persistent threat wasn't always physical, it was invisible. Illness spread like wildfire in these closed spaces. Skin infections, fevers, coughing that lingered for weeks, diseases that were barely understood and almost never treated effectively. Rooms were rarely disinfected, linens shared, air heavy and stale. What began with one client could, within days, move through the entire house, and there was no pause in the work. A sick woman was a liability. She either worked through it or lost her place. Worst of all were the conditions that attacked from within. There were no protections, no safeguards, no understanding of how to prevent conception or complications. Women became pregnant without consent, without preparation, and often without acknowledgement. The brothel didn't stop for pregnancies. A woman was expected to continue until her body gave out, and even after childbirth, she might be forced back into service before healing. There were no doctors, only midwives, many poorly trained or overworked, who could do little when something went wrong. And things often did go wrong. Hemorrhaging, infection, stillbirths, each one common, each one treated as a private tragedy no one had time to mourn. Children born in brothels were sometimes taken away, left with distant relatives, abandoned at church steps, or absorbed into the house as servants. The emotional toll of these losses was heavy, but rarely spoken aloud. Grief was a luxury. Silence was survival. Malnutrition deepened the suffering. The body, worn thin by labor and poor diet, became more vulnerable with each passing month. Women lost teeth early. Their skin aged before its time, and fatigue lived permanently behind their eyes. They did not sleep deeply. They did not rest fully. Even in stillness, their minds stayed alert, listening for footsteps, doors, or commands. And over time, something deeper began to fade, not just strength, but the sense of self. The line between the person they once were and the role they now played grew thinner until it vanished entirely. Some began to speak of themselves in the third person. Others stopped speaking at all. They were not victims in the way stories like to imagine them, helpless and fragile, but neither were they hardened survivors untouched by pain. They were both. They were women shaped by fire and sometimes broken by it. When one of them disappeared, carried away in the middle of the night, or simply gone by morning, the others knew not to ask. She had either run, fallen ill, or died. And whatever the truth, it didn't change what had to happen next. The room would be cleaned, the sheets replaced. A new name would be added to the ledger. Life in the brothel didn't pause for absence. It moved forward with brutal efficiency, and the city outside continued as though nothing had happened. The same officials who visited after dark spoke of order and decency by day. The same priests who condemned impurity ignored the broken bodies delivered to the graveyards behind chapels. There were no funerals, no markers, only unmarked plots and stories left untold. This was the hidden toll of the brothel, not the moral debates whispered in sermons or the fantasies passed around by curious youths, but the physical cost exacted from those within. A cost paid in blood, in breath, in quiet suffering. A cost so common, so routine, that it ceased to shock. And yet, it should, because behind every candlelit window was a life reduced to service. Behind every locked door was a body made vulnerable, not just by circumstance, but by design. And behind every silence was a scream that no one wanted to hear. As strange as it may seem, the same brothels that operated in hushed tones under moonlight often stepped boldly into the center of public celebration when daylight returned. In a paradox that would baffle modern sensibilities, medieval society managed to both shame and showcase its houses of pleasure. During certain festivals, carnivals, and civic parades, the women of these establishments were not hidden. They were invited, even featured. Laughter replaced judgment. Performance replaced secrecy. And for a brief window each year, the lines between the condemned and the celebrated blurred into something eerily festive. These weren't back alley gatherings or underground spectacles. They were full-scale, city-sanctioned events. During spring fairs, midsummer feasts, or the raucous days of carnival before Lent, brothel workers paraded through town in colorful costumes, sometimes on horseback, sometimes atop decorated wagons, drawing cheers from the same crowds that might avert their eyes the week before. It was a strange theater, part satire, part ritual, and entirely revealing. In many cities, particularly across France and the Italian states, brothel women were encouraged to participate in processions, to serve drinks at feasts, to stage comic performances poking fun at local officials and clergy. These acts were not seen as subversive, but as tradition. The bawdiness of these roles, intentionally exaggerated and theatrical, was accepted because it had rules. The chaos had boundaries. It was permission wrapped in ritual, misbehavior choreographed for entertainment. And the brothel in this setting was not a scandal, but a spectacle. Municipal leaders sometimes even funded these appearances. In places like Toulouse, Avignon, and parts of Flanders, the city would allocate a portion of the festival budget to the brothel district, not out of generosity, but because their presence was expected. Their involvement brought color, humor, and the kind of raw energy that the public, hungry for diversion, had come to anticipate. They were not hidden, they were headliners. And yet, this public role was never a form of real acceptance. It was closer to containment. By allowing the women to be visible during controlled moments, society could better suppress them the rest of the year. It was a kind of moral bookkeeping, giving space to indulgence so that it wouldn't spill over into the wrong places. The festivals served as a pressure valve, letting off the steam of hypocrisy without threatening the official order. The women themselves had mixed roles in these spectacles. For some, it was a welcome change, a chance to laugh, to dress differently, to be part of something bigger than the walls of the brothel. For others, it was just another kind of performance, one that required its own kind of resilience. The makeup was heavier, the gestures more exaggerated, the smiles wider. But underneath, the same debts, dangers, and dependencies waited. Applause did not erase the weight of the morning after. These public displays also served another purpose. They reinforced the idea that the brothel was part of the city's natural rhythm. It wasn't an outsider institution or a dirty secret. It was embedded in the landscape, stitched into its holidays and heritage. The fact that children waved at brothel parades, that merchants toasted their presence, and that priests sometimes stood watching from doorways said everything. The city wasn't conflicted, it was coordinated. Even the language used during festivals changed. The women were referred to in playful terms: queens of the feast, ladies of mirth, sisters of joy. Their labels softened for the day, only to sharpen again when the music stopped. It was temporary forgiveness, tied not to mercy but to convenience. Once the banners were taken down and the crowds dispersed, the old rules returned. The women who had played courtesans in the public square were again workers in a hidden house, subject to fines, restrictions, and the judgment of those who had cheered them hours earlier. The entire ritual revealed something deep and discomforting about the culture that enabled it. It wasn't simply that society tolerated brothels, it relied on them. They were part of the social contract, providing both release and entertainment, both income and order. Their visibility during festivals didn't contradict their marginalization, it completed it. It was a balancing act that allowed medieval cities to indulge without consequence, to laugh without guilt, to pretend that by controlling the narrative, they had mastered the reality. But the women knew better. They saw the costume change for what it was. They understood that the laughter would fade, the doors would close, and they would return to a world where the celebration was over, but the performance never stopped. Not all the stories that emerged from behind the brothel walls were ones of silence and resignation. Beneath the weight of debt, control, and violence, a different current moved, quietly, stubbornly, and often invisibly to the outside world. It was not loud or sweeping. It didn't come with banners or declarations, but it was resistance nonetheless. A whispered warning passed between beds. A portion of bread split in the kitchen when someone hadn't eaten in days. A refusal, carefully timed. A look shared that said, "You're not alone." In a world designed to pit them against one another, the women found ways to link arms, even if only for a moment. Solidarity inside a brothel was both essential and dangerous. The structure of the house thrived on division, competition for clients, punishments for speaking out, incentives for betraying each other's secrets. All of it was meant to keep the women isolated. But the same system that demanded rivalry also created shared pain, and shared pain has a way of building bridges. In the rare stillness between shifts, in the brief glances between dressing and duty, women began to learn each other's histories. Some had arrived from distant provinces, others had lived on the same street and never known. There was comfort in those fragments of truth, in realizing that what had happened to one had happened to many. They formed small alliances, nothing formal, but deeply felt. One might cover for another who was too ill to work. Someone might teach a newcomer how to navigate the temper of a dangerous client. An older woman might use her reputation to shield a younger one from unwanted attention. These acts didn't change the system, but they softened it, made it survivable. And every time a woman used her limited power to protect another, it carved a crack in the facade of control. But sometimes the resistance grew bolder. There are scattered records, faint and fragmentary, of women who organized against their keepers. In one brothel in the German-speaking lands, a group of women refused to work for several nights, locking themselves in their rooms until the food portions were increased. In another, a sudden fire broke out in the storage quarters, not accidental, some suspected, and forced the brothel to close for weeks. The authorities called it sabotage. The women called it deliverance. These small revolts didn't make it into official histories. They were buried beneath legal documents, retold in rumor, but they happened. More daring still were those who attempted escape, not through flight, but through reinvention. Some left to join religious orders, not out of faith alone, but because a convent, despite its austerity, offered a kind of safety the brothel never could. The veil, once adopted, erased a woman's past in a way few other choices could. These transformations required courage and luck. Some had to be smuggled out, protected by sympathetic patrons or relatives. Others pleaded their case before local councils, offering testimony about abuse and demanding their freedom. Even within the legal system, rigged as it was, there were attempts at justice. A woman might file a complaint against a violent client, risking retaliation. In rare cases, they appeared before courts to dispute unfair debts or to testify against a keeper who had gone too far. These legal documents survive in fragments, but they reveal something powerful, that even when every force was aligned to silence them, some women still raised their voices, not always to win, but to be heard. One of the most remarkable forms of defiance was simply storytelling. In the margins of ledgers, in letters dictated to sympathetic scribes, or in the mouths of traveling singers who had once known someone in the house, these women's experiences were passed on, not formally, not loudly, but persistently. The tales often changed with retelling, embroidered by time or fear, but their core remained. That behind the doors of shame lived women who dreamed, remembered, and sometimes refused. Not all solidarity was noble, not all resistance was clean, but the fact that it existed at all is a testament to something profound. That even in a place designed to strip people of identity and agency, a flicker of autonomy survived. That even when the structure pressed down with everything it had, rules, punishments, debts, and silence, there remained something it could never fully extinguish. The human need to stand together, to say no, to protect what little could still be called one's own. These stories may never dominate chronicles or textbooks. They weren't sung in cathedral choirs or immortalized in stone, but they lived in gestures, in decisions, in the quiet rebellion of kindness. And in those moments, the brothel was not just a site of endurance. It became, if only briefly, a site of resistance. In time, the same society that had once quietly protected and profited from its brothels began to recoil from them. The change did not come all at once, nor did it begin from a place of compassion for the women within. It began, as so many historical shifts do, with fear. Fear of disease, fear of moral collapse, fear of losing control. The very structures that had legitimized the brothel's existence for centuries, permits, taxes, regulations, were slowly turned against it. What was once managed became suspect. What had once been tolerated became a target. Epidemics played a critical role in this transformation. As waves of illness swept through Europe, officials searched for scapegoats. Public health, though poorly understood, became a growing obsession. And brothels, with their crowded rooms, transient visitors, and vulnerable inhabitants, were blamed. Authorities argued that these establishments were breeding grounds for contagion, not only physical, but moral. They linked sickness to sin, and in doing so, found justification for closures, raids, and new laws. Moral panics followed. Religious reformers, emboldened by shifts in power and doctrine, denounced the existence of houses of shame as evidence of societal decay. They no longer argued for control, they called for eradication. In some cities, processions were held to cleanse the streets, during which brothel doors were nailed shut and women driven out into the open with nowhere to go. New laws prohibited their return. Former clients became prosecutors. Priests who once visited under cover of night now condemned the same doors they used to enter. And yet, even as the brothels were shut down, the system that had created them remained intact. The closures did not come with social reform, or expanded rights, or new protections for the displaced women. Instead, many found themselves pushed further into invisibility, onto the streets, into illegal operations, or under the control of criminal networks far more violent than the licensed brothels of old. The state washed its hands of the institution, but not of its causes. Poverty, exploitation, and inequality didn't disappear. They simply changed locations. Some women sought refuge in the same places that had once condemned them. A few entered convents, if they could convince church authorities to accept them. Others disappeared into marriage or domestic labor, their histories erased as best they could manage. But most lived out their days on the margins, remembered by no one, recorded nowhere. The cities that had once profited from their presence now pretended they had never been there at all. What remained was silence. Generations passed. The brothel, once embedded in the daily rhythms of medieval life, became a historical footnote, often romanticized or mocked. Its women became caricatures in literature or shadows in scandal. Their labor was forgotten, their suffering ignored, and their stories, when told at all, were filtered through the lens of those who had never lived behind those doors. Today, we rarely speak of them, not because they were unimportant, but because to remember them honestly would mean confronting what they reveal. That systems of power don't simply vanish, they evolve. That exploitation can wear many faces, and that society is still deeply uncomfortable with the reality that intimacy, labor, and control have always been linked by threads we refuse to examine. The legacy of the brothel is not just about what happened then. It is about how we choose to remember or forget those who were forced to endure it. The shame they carried was not theirs alone. It was imposed, institutionalized, and later buried under layers of euphemism and myth. Even now, their voices remain largely absent from history's great halls. Not because they had nothing to say, but because no one wanted to listen. So we're left with fragments, ledger entries, court transcripts, the occasional whisper in a letter, and yet, from those fragments, a larger picture emerges, not just of survival, but of a world that depended on their silence, a world that still, in many ways, does. The brothel may be gone, its shutters closed for good, but the questions it raises remain. Who controls the narrative? Whose suffering is worth remembering? And how much of our present is built atop foundations we've never dared to uncover? The story does not end here. It waits, beneath the surface, in all the places we've chosen not to look.